The Great Hall of the Galactic Tribunal stretched across 3 kilometers of polished black stone, and every seat was filled with representatives from over 4,000 species who had come to watch the trial of the Vihari. Sayun stood at the center of the floor, her tall and slender body glowing with soft blue light that pulsed beneath her translucent skin like a heartbeat made visible to the naked eye. She was old, older than most of her kind ever lived to be, and the bioluminescent patterns across her arms and neck told the story of a life spent carrying the grief of her people on her narrow shoulders. The charges had been read already, and the words still echoed in the vast silence of the chamber. Genetic drift beyond acceptable parameters, emotional output exceeding safety thresholds, failure to conform to Concord Standard 11.7 regarding cognitive stability in the presence of allied species. In simpler words, the Vihari had committed the Vihari unforgivable crime of feeling too much. The Galactic Concord had ruled the galaxy for over 12,000 years, and in all that time it had maintained order through one absolute principle. Every species must be useful, every species must be stable, and every species must keep its emotions under control. The Vihali had once been able to do this, long ago, when their empathic abilities were faint and manageable, but evolution had other plans. Over the last several centuries, the empathic fields generated by every living Vihali had grown stronger and stronger until they could no longer be contained. When a Vihali felt sadness, every creature within 30 meters felt it too, and when a Vihali felt joy, the same thing happened. The Concord called this a defect, a dangerous malfunction of biology that disrupted the mental clarity of other species and threatened the stability of civilized space. Sayuni called it being alive. She looked up at the sky. Towering ring of judges, their faces hidden behind masks of smooth metal that reflected her own faint glow back at her, like a mirror showing her everything she was about to lose. "We are not a threat," she said, and her voice trembled, not because she was afraid, but because she could feel the contempt radiating from the judges above her, cold and sharp and utterly without mercy. "We have never harmed another species. We have never started a war. We have never broken a single law of the Concord, except the law that says we must stop being what we are." She paused, and the light beneath her skin flickered from blue to a deep and painful violet, the color of grief among her people. The effect was immediate. In the gallery above, a Torvasian diplomat began to cry without understanding why, and beside him, a Creel trade minister gripped the armrest of his chair as an unfamiliar wave of sorrow washed through his chest like cold water. Whispers spread through the column chamber, and the head judge slammed a resonance gavel that sent a pulse of sound through the floor. "This is exactly the disruption we are here to address," the head judge said, his voice flat and mechanical behind his mask. "The defendant will restrain her emissions or be silenced." But Sayuen could not restrain them, and that was the whole point, and that was the whole tragedy. The verdict came within the hour, because the outcome had been decided long before the trial began. Total expulsion under Concord Statute 9, the same statute that had been used against the Hulwen 600 years ago, the same one used against the Dratha, and the Yumi, and the Pilkis, and at least 9 other species whose names had been quietly erased from the galactic record. The sentence meant everything. Their home system of Velhari Prime, 3 planets orbiting a gentle orange star, where their species had lived for over 20,000 years, was to be seized, redistributed to Concord members. Their fleet, a desperate collection of ships that held nearly 800 million Velari, who had already been preparing for the worst, would be stripped of all faster-than-light drives and given only basic slow ship engines, barely capable of reaching a fraction of light speed. And they would be pushed beyond the borders of Concord space into the dead corridor, a vast and empty stretch of void between the galactic arms where there were no habitable worlds, no resources, and no hope. It was not technically a death sentence, because the Concord did not believe in such barbaric things. It was simply a quiet and efficient way of making a species disappear without having to pull the trigger themselves. Sayuan was escorted back to the Velari fleet under armed guard, and as the shuttle carried her away from the tribunal, she pressed her hand against the cold window and watched the great station shrink behind her. Still feel them. All 4,000 species packed into that enormous structure, and not one of them had spoken in her defense. Not one of them had said, "This is wrong." Not one of them had stood up and said, "These people deserve to live." She understood why, and that was the worst part. Every species in the Concord had seen what happened to those who were different, and every species in the Concord was afraid that one day they would be next. And so they stayed silent and watched and told themselves it was necessary. The exodus began 3 days later. 800 million Velhari packed into ships that were never designed for long voyages, ships with failing life support and cracked hulls and engines that groaned under the strain of carrying so many souls toward nothing. Children pressed their faces against viewports and watched their home star grow smaller and smaller until it was just another dot among billions, and their parents held them and tried not to let them feel the despair that was spreading through every deck of every ship like a slow and terrible poison. Sayune stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, a converted cargo hauler called the Lament of Skies, and she watched the stars ahead of them, dark and unfamiliar and terribly far apart. Behind them, the Concord border markers pulsed once in red and then went dark, sealing the door on everything they had ever known. She had read the histories, the secret ones that the Concord tried to erase, and she knew what had happened to the species that came before them in this corridor of silence. The Hallwind had lasted 11 years before starvation took the last of them. The Drotha had lasted 3. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the grief of 800 million people pressing against her mind like an ocean held back by a wall of glass, and she wondered how long the Velari would last. Then something happened. Officer, a young male whose skin was flickering with the pale green of confusion, turned from his console and spoke with a voice that shook. "Matriarch, I am receiving a signal." Sayun opened her eyes and looked at him and said nothing because she did not dare to hope. "It is not Concord," he said. "It is not Velari. It is not any language in our database, but it is structured, and it is repeating, and it is coming from deep inside the corridor." He paused, and his skin shifted to something Sayun had not seen in months, a warm and trembling gold that meant wonder. "There is music in it, Matriarch. I do not understand the words, but there is music." Sayun walked to the console and placed her hand on the receiver, and let the signal wash over her empathic senses. And what she felt was not words, and not language, and not anything she could explain to someone who could not feel as her people felt. It was warmth, the kind that comes from a fire on a cold night when someone moves over to make room for you. It was a feeling she had never received from anyone outside her own species, and it said without words, and without doubt, and without any hesitation at all, "You are welcome here." She pulled her hand back and stared at the console, and her skin blazed with a color her people had almost forgotten. A bright and burning gold that meant something so rare and so fragile that she was almost afraid to name it. Hope. 300 years before the Velhari were cast into the void, a small Concord survey drone had entered a quiet and unremarkable solar system on the outer edge of the galaxy's western arm. It had scanned the third planet from the star, a blue and green world covered in water and chaos, and it had catalogued the dominant species: bipedal, warm-blooded, excessively social, prone to irrational attachments, and dangerously emotional. The drone had filed its report under classification category null, a designation reserved for species considered so fundamentally incompatible with the Concorde's values that contact was not only unnecessary, but inadvisable. The report's final line read simply, "Emotional hyperexpressives, no strategic value, recommend permanent exclusion from contact protocols." And so the Galactic Concorde had sealed the file and moved on, and forgotten about the strange little species on the strange little planet. And that was the single biggest mistake they had ever made, because the humans did not wait for an invitation. They built their own ships, ugly and loud, and powered by engines that the Concorde would have considered dangerously primitive. And they pushed out into the stars with the kind of stubborn and reckless energy that only a species with no idea what was out there could muster. They colonized worlds that the Concorde had marked as worthless, frozen moons and scorching deserts, and heavy gravity rocks that no sensible species would touch. And they did not just survive on these worlds, they thrived, and they laughed, and they built cities, and planted gardens in places where nothing was supposed to grow. By the time the Velari were exiled, humanity had spread across 47 star systems, and had absolutely no idea that a galactic government existed, or that they had been deliberately excluded from it. Captain Riva Osei, of the Terran service vessel Mama Bear, was not thinking about any of this when her long-range sensors picked up a mass of unknown contacts drifting through the dead corridor. She was thinking about the fact that her coffee machine was broken, and that her engineer had promised to fix it 2 weeks ago, and had not. And she was thinking about whether the cargo of industrial parts they were hauling to the frontier colony on Harding's world would arrive on time. Then her sensor officer said the words that changed everything. "Captain, I am reading approximately 9,000 vessels on an intercept trajectory. All of them are running on minimal power, and most of them are showing critical system failures across the board." Riva set down her empty coffee mug and walked to the sensor display, and what she saw made her stomach drop. It was not a fleet in any military sense of the word. It was a floating graveyard of broken ships packed so tightly together that they looked like a cloud of metal and desperation, were fluctuating in ways that told her there were people on those ships who were running out of air and running out of food and running out of time. "Open a channel," she said, "all frequencies, all languages we have on file, and throw in some music too, because if they do not understand our words, maybe they will understand that we are not here to hurt them." The signal went out, and for 17 long minutes there was nothing but silence, and Riva stood on her bridge with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and waited. Then a response came back, not in words, but in light, a soft and pulsing blue glow that filled the view screen as one of the larger vessels turned toward them and opened what appeared to be a communication array. The Velhari had found the source of the signal they had been following for weeks, and it was not what they expected. It was a single ship, small and battered, and clearly built by a species that valued function over form, crewed by beings who were loud and fleshy and radiating so much uncontrolled emotion that Sayun could feel them from across the void, like a bonfire in the darkness. When the first shuttle docked and the airlock opened, Riva Osei stepped through and came face to face with Sayun, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Sayun was tall and luminous and heartbreakingly beautiful in the way that a candle is beautiful when it is almost burned down to nothing. And her skin was flickering with colors that Riva could not read, but could somehow feel in a place behind her ribs that she did not have a name for. Then Sayun's empathic field hit the humans. It was not subtle. It was 800 million people's worth of grief and terror and exhaustion compressed into a wave that rolled through the shuttle bay like a physical force, and every human in the room felt it at the same time. The sensor officer grabbed the wall and his eyes filled with tears he did not understand. Medic sat down hard on the deck and pressed her hands over her mouth. Riva felt it too. All of it. The loss and the fear and the bone-deep tiredness of a people who had been told by the entire galaxy that they did not deserve to exist. And something inside her chest that had been built during a childhood on a colony world where neighbors helped neighbors, and strangers were just friends you had not met yet, rose up like a wall against the despair. She stepped forward, and she put her arms around Sayun. The old Velari went rigid, because no alien had ever touched her with kindness before. No species outside her own had ever responded to the empathic wave with anything other than revulsion and fear and anger. And this strange small creature with the dark skin and the fierce eyes was holding her, and the feeling radiating from her was so raw and so powerful that Sayun could not even name it at first. It was compassion, but not the quiet and distant kind that the Sayun had. Concord preached in its diplomatic halls while signing exile orders with clean hands. It was the loud and messy and furious kind. The kind that grabbed you by the shoulders and said, "I see you, and I am angry on your behalf, and you are not alone anymore." Behind Riva, the rest of her crew was already moving, some of them crying openly from the empathic resonance, and none of them caring. Pulling out emergency rations, and medical kits, and blankets, and anything they could find. And a young engineer, who had still not fixed the coffee machine, was kneeling beside a Velari child, and offering her a chocolate bar, with hands that would not stop shaking. Riva pulled back from Sayun, and looked her in the eyes and spoke. "How many of you are there?" 800 million, Sayun whispered, and her voice broke on the number, because saying it out loud made the impossibility of their situation real in a way that thinking it never had. Riva did not flinch. She did not hesitate. She did not do the math on resources or logistics or political consequences. She simply turned to her communications officer and said the words that would be carved into monuments and taught in schools and remembered for as long as either species drew breath. "Send a priority signal to Earth and every colony in the network. Tell them we have 800 million refugees inbound, and they need to get the spare beds ready." The communications officer stared at her for exactly 2 seconds, and then he smiled and said, "Yes, Captain." And the signal went out at the speed of light toward a species that had never met an alien before today, and was about to find out what kind of people they really were. On Earth, the United Terran Council convened an emergency session within 6 hours of receiving the message. There were debates, because humans always debated. There were arguments about resources and capacity, and whether this was a trap. Voices of suspicion, and voices that said we cannot afford this, and we do not know these creatures, and we should be careful. But there were louder voices too, voices that remembered a history full of moments exactly like this one, moments where people had fled from cruelty and landed on the shores of strangers, and the strangers had to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. The vote was not unanimous, because nothing human ever was, but it was overwhelming. And when the result was transmitted back to the mama bear, Riva read it aloud on the bridge, with Sayune standing beside her, and the old Velari's skin erupted in that bright and burning gold again, and this time she was not afraid to name it. It was hope, and for the first time in her long and weary life, it was not fragile, not just Earth. Though Earth had changed too, with entire districts and cities around the globe softly glowing at night, from the bioluminescent skin of their new neighbors. But the colonies as well, Mars and Titan and the frontier worlds scattered across human space, had all opened their doors, and 800 million Velhari had poured through them like water finding its level. It was not easy, and no one pretended it was. There were misunderstandings in the early weeks that could have become disasters, if not for the strange and powerful chemistry between the two species that no one had predicted and no one could fully explain. A Velhari family settling into an apartment block in New Helsinki had projected such intense anxiety during their first night that every human resident in the building had a panic attack at 3 in the morning. and the emergency services had been overwhelmed with calls from people who suddenly felt terrified and did not know why. Vehlari Elder, walking through a market in the Mars colony of Ares Landing, had been so moved by the sight of fresh fruit, something his people had not seen in months, that his joy had radiated outward and caused an entire street of humans to burst into spontaneous laughter and tears of happiness, which had been confusing for everyone involved, but especially for the fruit vendor, who thought she was losing her mind. But these were growing pains, and humans were very good at growing. Within weeks, the first Vehlari empaths began working alongside human therapists, and what they discovered together shook the foundations of mental health care across all of human space. A Vehlari could feel exactly what a human was carrying inside them, every buried grief, and every hidden wound, and every piece of pain that had been pushed down so deep that the human themselves had forgotten it was there. And they could bring it gently to the surface, where it could finally be seen, and finally be healed. Veterans who had not slept through the night in 20 years sat in rooms with Vehlari healers and wept for hours, and walked out lighter than they had been since before the wars that broke them. Children who had grown up in homes where no one talked about feelings learned for the first time that the heavy thing in their chest had a name, and that naming it was the first step to letting it go. Suicide rates across human space dropped by 40% in 4 months, and the number kept falling. And in return, humans gave the Vehlari something equally transformative. For all their empathic power, the Vehlari had always been a gentle species, so gentle that gentleness had become a cage, and they had never learned to stand up for themselves because their culture had taught them that to push back against another being's emotions was the greatest sin imaginable. Humans taught them that this was nonsense, not cruelly, not with lectures or lessons, but in the way humans taught everything important, by example, by living it, by being the loud and stubborn and gloriously imperfect creatures they had always been. Kale was 14 years old, and he had spent the first 6 months on the colony world of Briar's Reach, trying to make himself as small and as quiet as possible, dimming his bioluminescence until he was barely visible, pulling his empathic field in so tight that it gave him headaches, doing everything he could to not be a burden and not be a problem and not be the thing that made people uncomfortable. Then he met Tomas Reyes. Tomas was 15, and he was everything the Vehlari were not, loud and physical and utterly incapable of hiding a single emotion he had ever felt in his entire short and chaotic life. He found Kale sitting alone behind the colony school during lunch, glowing so faintly that he was almost invisible against the wall, and he sat down next to him without asking, and offered him half a bottle sandwich, and said, "You look like you are trying to disappear, and I want you to know that is a terrible plan, because I can still see you." Kale had been so startled that his empathic field slipped, and Tomas was hit with a wave of loneliness so sharp that it made his eyes sting. And instead of recoiling or getting angry, Tomas just sat there and let it wash over him, and then said, "Yeah, that is rough. Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to throw rocks at that fence? Because both work, honestly." They threw rocks at the fence, and then they talked, and then they threw more rocks, and by the end of the afternoon, Kale's skin was glowing brighter than it had since before the exile. Over the months that followed, Tomas taught Kale things that no Vehlari had ever learned. He taught him that it was okay to be angry, that anger was not a disease, but a signal that something was wrong and needed to change. He taught him to raise his voice when someone was being unfair, and to stand his ground when someone tried to push him around, and to understand that being kind did not mean being quiet, and being gentle did not mean being weak. And Kale taught Tomas things that no human had ever truly understood. He taught him to sit with his feelings instead of running from them, to let sadness exist without trying to fix it or fight it, to understand that the people around him were carrying invisible weights, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was simply say, "I feel you, and I am here." Together, they became something neither species had been alone, and the adults watched them and realized that this was not just a friendship, but a blueprint for what both peoples could become. Meanwhile, Sayun had been spending her days in meetings with the leaders of human civilization, and on a quiet evening in the garden of the Terran presidential residence, she sat with President Adaeze Okafor beneath a sky full of unfamiliar stars, told her the truth she had been holding back. "They will come for us," Sayun said, and her skin was the deep violet of worry. "The Concord does not exile species and then allow them to be rescued. The entire system depends on the exiled disappearing. If other species in the Concord learn that there is somewhere to go, somewhere safe, the fear that holds the Concord together will begin to crack." Okafor was a tall woman with steady eyes and hands that had signed both peace treaties and military orders, and she listened without interrupting until Sayun was finished. "How many species have they done this to before you?" she asked. "At least 12 that we know of," Sayun said. "Probably more. The records are destroyed, the names are erased. It is as if they never existed at all." Okafor was quiet for a long time, and the garden was quiet too, except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant hum of a city that was learning to glow in there. Dark. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm and certain in a way that Sayune had only ever heard from people who had already made their decision, and were simply informing the universe of it. "Good," she said. "Let them come and explain themselves." Sayune looked at her and felt something radiating from this human woman that she had only ever felt from her own people before. A fierce and unyielding protectiveness that burned like a star behind her ribs. And Sayune understood for the first time why humanity had survived in a galaxy that had never wanted them. They did not survive because they were strong, though they were strong. They did not survive because they were clever, though they were clever. They survived because when they decided something was theirs to protect, they became a force that did not know how to stop. 3 days later, a Concord diplomatic vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system. A message on all frequencies. The message was addressed to the unregistered species occupying Sector 7 Null, and it contained a single demand: return the Valari exiles immediately or be declared hostile by the Galactic Concord. Okafor read the message in her office, and then she picked up her coffee and took a long sip, and set the mug down, and said to her aide with absolutely no change in her expression, "Tell them we would be happy to discuss this, and invite them to come closer so we can talk face to face." She paused, and then smiled in a way that was not warm at all. "And make sure the olive branch is ready, full diplomatic crew, full honors, and full weapons loadout, because I believe in being polite, but I also believe in being clear." The Terran diplomatic flagship Olive Branch was a contradiction in metal and meaning, and the humans who built her were deeply proud of that fact. She was beautiful, in the way a clenched fist could be beautiful, sleek and powerful and bristling with enough weaponry to crack a small moon, and her name was painted in white letters across her hull, in a font that was almost cheerful, as if the people who named her understood that the best way to keep peace was to make war very expensive for anyone who tried to break it. Ambassador David Achebe stood in the main reception hall and watched through the viewport as the Concord diplomatic vessel approached, a perfect silver needle of a ship that moved with the kind of effortless grace that came from technology thousands of years more advanced than anything humanity possessed. He was not nervous, because nervousness was something he had trained out of himself decades ago, during a career spent negotiating with people who wanted things he was not willing to give. But he was alert in the way a person becomes alert when they know the next few hours will decide the shape of the future. The Concord delegation came aboard in perfect formation, 12 representatives from 12 species, all of them tall and composed and wearing robes of seamless white that signified diplomatic authority, and at their head was Ambassador Jural Kethvan of the Morthesi, a scaled and angular being with 4 eyes that moved independently, and a reputation for dismantling lesser civilizations with words alone. Jural stepped onto the olive branch, and immediately something was wrong. The ship was alive with noise, music playing from somewhere down a corridor. 2 crew members arguing about a card game while walking past the delegation without even slowing down. A burst of laughter from an open doorway, and most disturbingly, a Velhari child sitting cross-legged on the deck near the observation lounge, drawing on the bulkhead with colored wax sticks while a human crew member watched and offered suggestions. The child's skin was glowing a happy pink, and the crew member was smiling, and neither of them seemed even slightly concerned that the most powerful diplomatic delegation in the galaxy was walking past them. Jural's 4 eyes narrowed independently, and he turned to Achebe with an expression that conveyed a very precise and very ancient kind of contempt. "Your vessel is in disorder," he said. "Thank you," Achebe replied. "We try." The negotiations, if they could be called that, began in a conference room that the humans had set up, with refreshments on one side and a large display screen on the other. And Jural wasted no time with pleasantries, because the Concord did not believe in them. "You are harboring exiled subjects of the Galactic Concord," he said, and his voice filled the room like cold water filling a glass. "This is a violation of Statute 9, and the penalty for interference with an active exile order is severe. You will return the Velari to the dead corridor within 30 standard days, or the Concord will initiate corrective integration of your species." Achebe, who had spent his entire career listening to threats delivered by people who believed they held all the power in the room, leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Could you define corrective integration for us?" he said. "We are new to galactic politics, and we want to make sure we understand." Jural blinked 2 of his 4 eyes, which was the Morphesi equivalent of being caught off guard by a question he had not expected. "It is the systematic realignment of a non-compliant species to Concord standards," he said, "through orbital suppression if necessary." "Orbital suppression," Achebe repeated. "You mean bombing our planets until we comply?" "I mean whatever is necessary to restore order." Achebe nodded slowly, as if he were genuinely considering this, and then he asked the question that he had been carrying in his chest like a loaded weapon since the day he first learned about the Galactic Concord. "Ambassador Jural, what happened to the other 12 species that were exiled before the Velari?" The room went very quiet. Jural's scales shifted color slightly, a reaction so subtle that only someone trained in xenobehavioral analysis would have noticed it. And his voice when he spoke was perfectly controlled. "Exiled species are removed from Concord jurisdiction. Their subsequent status is not our concern." "I see," Achebe said, and then he pressed a control on the table, and the large display screen behind him came to life. The first image was a ghost fleet, thousands of ships drifting in the void, dead and dark, their hulls cracked open to space like eggshells, and inside them the frozen remains of beings who had starved to death, waiting for help that never came. "The Hulwen," Achebe said. "Our exploration teams found them 18 months ago in the dead corridor, approximately 11 years after their exile. Every single one of them dead, including what our forensic teams estimate were over 2 million children." He pressed the control again, and a new image appeared. A barren world scarred with the remnants of a desperate colony. Crude shelters built from shipwreckage, empty water collectors, and graves. Thousands upon thousands of graves, dug into dry soil, by hands that knew they were digging for a dead future. "The Drotha," Achebe said. 3 years after exile, they tried to settle on a barren world in the corridor. They made it 3 years before the water ran out. He pressed again and again and again, and each image was worse than the last. The Yumi frozen in their ships, still holding their children. The Pilkes who had eaten through their seed banks, and then each other. Species after species after species, consigned to the void, and forgotten by a civilization that called itself the pinnacle of galactic order. The Concord delegates were shifting in their seats, and several of them had turned away from the screen, and Jural's scales had gone a shade paler. But his voice remained steady. "This is propaganda," he said. "These species were removed for valid reasons, and their fate beyond our borders is not your concern." "Yes, you said that," HFY interrupted, and his voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now. Something that the Velari on the ship could feel, radiating through the walls, like heat from a furnace. "But I think it will be of concern to quite a few people." He pressed one final control, and the display changed to show a transmission log. The same images, the same evidence, the same documentation of 12 dead species, broadcasting live on every open frequency in the galaxy. Every Concord communication channel, every public broadcast system that humanity's surprisingly capable signals corps had been able to access, was now showing the same thing. The truth about what happened to the exiled, delivered without commentary, because the images did not need any. Jural stood, and his 4 eyes were all focused on HFY now, and for the first time, there was something in them that looked very much like fear. "You do not understand what you have done," he said. "The Concord has 4,000 species and 1,000,000 warships, and you are one world with 47 worlds, HFY corrected him gently. "And we do not need to beat your fleet, Ambassador." He stood as well, and he was shorter than Jural by nearly a meter, but the difference in height did not seem to matter at all. "We just need every species in your Concord who has ever been afraid of being the next one exiled to know that there is somewhere else to go." Jural stared at him, and the room was silent. Only sound was the faint hum of the olive branch's engines, and somewhere far away, down a corridor, the sound of a child laughing. The Concord delegation left within the hour, and their silver needle of a ship turned and accelerated away from Sol space. And no shots were fired, and no war was declared. But everyone in that room knew that something had changed that could not be unchanged. That evening, HFY authorized the activation of a signal that had been prepared weeks in advance. A broadcast in every known language, on every frequency humanity could reach, repeating on an endless loop from transmitters placed at the edge of human space. The message was simple, and it said, "If you have nowhere left to go, come to us, there is room." Within weeks, the first ships began arriving. They were not Velrari, they were Tessic and Brone and Velkari, species still inside the Concord, who had heard the broadcast and seen the evidence, and realized that the order they had lived under for thousands of years was built not on justice, but on fear. And that fear had just been given an alternative. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a river. And the river pointed toward a small and stubborn species on the edge of the galaxy, who had done the one thing the Concord never planned for. They had left the light on. 5 years had passed since the day a battered cargo hauler called the Mama Bear had found 800 million dying strangers in the dark, and had decided without hesitation that they were not strangers at all. The galaxy had not stopped turning since that day, but it had changed direction in ways that no one, not the humans and not the Velari, and certainly not the Galactic Concord, had been able to predict. The Terran Commonwealth was what they called it now, though the name was slightly misleading, because there was nothing exclusively Terran about it anymore. 47 species had joined in 5 years, each one arriving with their own story of being too different, or too strange, or too alive for a civilization that demanded conformity as the price of survival. And each one had been met at the border by ships with open cargo bays, and crews who said welcome and meant it. The Commonwealth was messy in a way that would have given any Concord administrator a fatal aneurysm. Council meetings were conducted in 14 languages simultaneously, with real-time empathic translation provided by Velari liaisons, who had become so integrated into human governance that no one could imagine doing politics without them. The Capitol building on Earth had been redesigned 3 times, because every new species that joined had different environmental requirements, and the architects had eventually given up on elegance and just built something that worked, a sprawling and chaotic structure that looked like it had been designed by a committee of dreamers, which was exactly what it was. There were problems, because there were always problems when you put that many different kinds of people together in one place, and the humans did not pretend otherwise. A Brone hive cluster and a Tessic solitary pod had gotten into a territorial dispute on one of the frontier colonies that had nearly escalated into violence before a joint Velari human mediation team had talked them down over the course of a very long and very emotional weekend. The economy was a patchwork of incompatible systems, held together by stubbornness and good faith, and an alarming number of informal agreements written on napkins. But every species in the Commonwealth had chosen to be there, and that single fact made it fundamentally different from the Concord in a way that no amount of military power or technological superiority could overcome. The Concord understood this, and that was why they were afraid. Not of the Commonwealth's ships, which were fewer and less advanced, not of their weapons, which were crude by Concord standards, but of the idea itself, the radical and dangerous notion that a civilization could be built on acceptance rather than control, on the principle that being different was not a defect to be corrected, but a strength to be celebrated. If that idea spread, the Concord would not fall to an invasion, would fall to an exodus. And so the Concord High Command made the decision that frightened empires have made since the beginning of time. They mobilized their fleet. 1 million warships gathered at the border of Commonwealth space, the largest military force assembled in galactic history, and their mission was not conquest, but containment. They were there to build a wall around the Commonwealth, to blockade every route in and out, to prevent any more species from leaving the Concord, and to slowly and methodically strangle the rogue civilization until it collapsed under the weight of its own idealism. Kale was 20 years old when the fleet arrived. He was no longer the frightened child who had hidden behind a school building trying to make himself invisible. He was a Commonwealth diplomat, the youngest in the service, and his skin glowed with a steady and confident light that shifted between colors as fluidly as a human changed expressions. He stood on the wall, bridge of the Commonwealth vessel's steady hand, and looked at the wall of warships filling the view screen from edge to edge, and he was afraid, but he did not dim his light, because Tomas had taught him years ago that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. Tomas was there too, standing beside him in a captain's uniform that he wore like it was a second skin. His arms crossed and his jaw set in that way that Kale had learned meant he was calculating odds and not liking them, but refusing to back down. "That is a lot of ships," Tomas said. "Yes," Kale agreed. "You still want to do this?" Kale looked at his friend, his brother in every way that mattered, and his skin flickered gold. "I have to." The plan had been Kale's idea, born from a late-night conversation with Sayuin, in which the old matriarch had told him something she had never told anyone before, that the Velhari's empathic field had no theoretical limit on range. It was only limited by power and by the emotional intensity of the source. And that if an empath of sufficient strength was given sufficient amplification, there was no reason the field could not reach across the void of space itself. Humanity had provided the amplification. They were not good at elegant technology, but they were very good at taking a simple idea and making it bigger than anyone thought possible. And the engineers at the Commonwealth Signal Corps had built an array that could take a single Velari empathic pulse and broadcast it across a radius of several light minutes, with enough fidelity to make every living being within range feel exactly what the empath was feeling. Kale was that empath. He walked alone to the center of the broadcast chamber, a room lined with human-built amplifiers and Velari resonance crystals woven together in a way that neither species could have achieved alone. And he stood in the middle of it all, and he closed his eyes. He thought about the exile, about being 6 years old and watching his home star disappear through a cracked viewport, while his mother held him and tried not to cry. He thought about the dead corridor, about the cold and the dark, and the slow, terrible certainty that no one was coming and no one cared. He thought about a girl named Lasiri, who had been his age, and who had died on the refugee ships because the medicine ran out 3 days before the humans found them. And he thought about her face, and the color of her skin when she smiled, and the fact that she would never know that they made it. And then he thought about Reva Ose stepping through an airlock and putting her arms around Sayun. He thought about Tomas sitting down next to him without asking, and offering him half a sandwich. He thought about 800 million people being told for the first time in their lives that they were welcome, not because they were useful, because they were profitable, not because they had earned it, but simply because they were alive, and that was enough. He thought about what it felt like to have a home after believing you would never have one again. And he opened his empathic field as wide as it would go, and the amplifiers caught it and multiplied it and sent it out in every direction at the speed of light. And the wave hit the Concorde fleet like a sunrise. 1 million warships crewed by soldiers from dozens of species who had spent their entire lives being told that emotion was weakness, and that obedience was strength, and that the exiled deserved their fate, felt all of it at once. The grief of being thrown away, the despair of drifting in the dark, the shock of a stranger's hand reaching out, the overwhelming and undeniable warmth of being taken in. Soldiers stopped what they were doing and stared at nothing, as tears they did not understand rolled down faces and scales. Chitin plates. Weapons officers lifted their hands from firing controls because the thought of adding more grief to what they were feeling was suddenly unbearable. Commanders opened channels to ask what was happening and found that they could not speak because their throats were tight with an emotion they had been trained since birth to suppress, and it was pouring out of them now like water from a broken dam. One by one, the ships went silent. One by one, weapons powered down, not because they were defeated, but because they understood, for the first time, what the Concorde had really been doing for 12,000 years, and the understanding was not something they could unfeel. Sayun watched from the bridge of the steady hand, her old body wrapped in a blanket that a human crew member had draped over her shoulders without being asked, and her skin was glowing with every color she had ever known, shifting and blending into something new that she did not have a word for. President Okafor stood beside her, both of them watching the wall of warships go dark and quiet. And for a long time neither of them said anything, because some moments are too large for words. Then Sayuin spoke, and her voice was barely above a whisper. When we were cast out, we thought the universe had no place for us. Okafor took her hand, human fingers wrapped around Velari luminescence, and she held it gently and firmly in the way that humans held things they intended to never let go of. The universe did not, she said. We made one. The Concorde did not collapse that day because empires built over 12,000 years do not fall in an afternoon. But it fractured along lines that had always been there, and had only needed one moment of honesty to become visible. Species that had been afraid for centuries began to speak, and then to move, and the border that was meant to be a wall became a door, because it conquered, but because it welcomed. Months later, Tomas took his ship to the dead corridor, which was not dead anymore. Commonwealth terraforming crews had been working there for 2 years, seeding atmosphere on barren worlds and planting life in soil that had never known it. And on every world where an exiled species had perished, they had built a memorial, Not grand monuments of stone and metal, but gardens, living, breathing gardens full of plants from every Commonwealth world, growing together in soil made rich by the memory of those who had been lost. Kale stood beside Tomas on the surface of the world where the Dratha had died, and all around them green things were growing where nothing had grown before, and in the distance a river that human engineers had coaxed from deep underground was catching the light of a foreign star. Kale's skin was glowing with a color Tomas had never seen before, something beyond gold, beyond warmth, something that seemed to contain every good thing that had ever happened to a people who had been told they were nothing. Tomas looked at him and grinned the way only Tomas could grin, wide and crooked, and full of a joy so honest it almost hurt. "What is that one?" he asked. "I have not seen that color before." Kale looked out at the river and the gardens and the memorials, and the sky full of stars that were no longer cold, and no longer empty, and no longer belonging to a galaxy that threw away the things it did not understand. He thought about a signal in the dark that carried music. He thought about arms that held without asking. He thought about a species that had been rejected by the galaxy, and had responded not with war and not with bitterness, but by building the biggest table they could find and setting extra places and leaving the door open and the light on for anyone who needed it. He looked at Tomas, and his skin blazed with that nameless color. Word that fit. P. Home.